Sometimes the quietest act of kindness changes the destiny of an entire kingdom. The wind howled across the frozen valley of Frost Hollow, carrying sharp crystals of snow that danced like tiny shards of glass beneath the pale winter sky. Towering pine trees stood covered in thick blankets of white, their branches bending beneath the weight of fresh snowfall, while the broad river that divided the valley had hardened into a glittering sheet of ice stretching nearly 100 yards from shore to shore. Most villagers had already returned home before the approaching storm grew stronger, but Emily Carter remained alone beyond the tree line, carefully gathering the last bundles of winter herbs that could still be found beneath patches of evergreen moss. Emily was a 22-year-old white-skinned Omega with long golden-brown hair tucked beneath a simple wool hood, gentle blue eyes, and a weathered gray cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders to protect against the bitter cold. A woven basket filled with medicinal roots rested against her back as she quietly thanked the forest for another successful day before beginning the long walk home. The fading afternoon light slowly disappeared behind thick gray clouds, and silence settled over the valley until it was suddenly broken by a faint sound drifting across the frozen river. It was not the cry of a bird or the crack of shifting ice. It was a weak, lonely howl filled with exhaustion. Emily immediately stopped walking. She listened carefully as the wind carried the sound once more, softer this time, but unmistakably alive. Without hesitation, she turned toward the riverbank. Snow swirled around her boots while she searched the endless stretch of white until her eyes finally found the source. Near the center of the frozen shoreline lay an enormous white wolf, its thick fur dusted with snow, one foreleg held awkwardly beneath its body, as though every movement caused discomfort. The magnificent animal struggled to lift its head before collapsing back against the ice. Emily's heart tightened. The wolf was far larger than any she had ever seen, yet there was no anger in its pale silver eyes. There was only fatigue and quiet determination. Every instinct warned her to keep her distance. Wolves were powerful creatures, and winter often made desperate animals unpredictable. Yet another part of her heart refused to leave a suffering life behind simply because it inspired fear. She slowly knelt several yards away, keeping her movements calm and her voice gentle. "It is all right," she whispered through the cold wind. "I am not here to hurt you." The wolf lifted its head only slightly, watching her with unusual stillness. It neither growled nor retreated. Instead, its steady gaze seemed almost thoughtful, as though carefully measuring the kindness standing before it. Emily cautiously removed her wool scarf and folded it into a soft cushion before sliding it across the ice. The wolf rested its injured leg upon the fabric without resistance. She noticed the animal trembling as another icy gust swept across the valley, and only then did she realize the approaching snowstorm would become far more dangerous before nightfall. If the wolf remained where it was, the dropping temperature alone could become impossible to survive. Emily looked toward the distant lights of Frost Hollow glowing faintly beyond the frozen river, then back toward the exhausted creature lying alone against the endless white landscape. She quietly closed her eyes for a single moment, drew a slow breath, and made a decision that no one else would ever expect an ordinary Omega to make. Whatever waited across the frozen river, she would not leave the injured wolf behind to face the storm alone. Emily Carter carefully stepped closer until only a few feet separated her from the enormous white wolf. The freezing wind whipped loose strands of golden-brown hair across her face, yet her attention never left the exhausted animal lying against the icy riverbank. The wolf watched every movement with pale silver eyes that reflected intelligence far beyond what she expected from any wild creature. It remained perfectly still, breathing slowly as though conserving every remaining ounce of strength. Emily gently placed her woven basket onto the snow before removing the thick wool blanket she carried for emergencies during long winter walks. "I know this will frighten you," she whispered softly, her voice nearly disappearing beneath the rising wind. "But if we both stay here much longer, neither of us will make it home before the storm." She slowly unfolded the blanket and carefully draped part of it over the wolf's shoulders. Instead of resisting, the great animal lowered its head, almost as though it understood every word she spoke. Emily glanced toward the frozen river stretching nearly 100 yards across the valley. Thin streams of snow raced over the smooth ice, while distant cracks echoed somewhere beneath the frozen surface. The safest crossing had become dangerous, and every villager knew that winter rivers demanded respect. Even so, her small cabin waited on the opposite side, where a warm fireplace, dry shelter, clean water, and healing herbs could give the injured wolf a chance to recover. She took another slow breath before kneeling beside the animal. "I am going to help you stand," she said gently. "Please trust me." With remarkable patience, she slipped one arm beneath the wolf's chest while supporting its injured foreleg as carefully as possible. The wolf struggled briefly before managing to rise, placing most of its weight upon the stronger legs. Emily immediately realized the journey would be far more difficult than she had imagined. The wolf was powerful, broad-shouldered, and much heavier than she expected, yet it leaned against her with surprising care, almost deliberately avoiding placing too much weight upon her smaller frame. Step by careful step, they began moving toward the frozen river. Emily tested the ice before every stride, listening closely for unusual sounds beneath her boots. The snowstorm intensified, reducing visibility until the far shoreline nearly disappeared behind blowing white curtains of wind. Several times Emily nearly lost her footing, but each time the wolf shifted its balance just enough to steady her instead of allowing them both to fall. She found herself quietly smiling despite the bitter cold. "Thank you," she whispered almost instinctively. The wolf turned its head slightly toward her, its calm silver eyes meeting hers for only a moment before looking ahead once again. Their slow journey continued across the endless sheet of ice, neither one speaking, neither one surrendering to fear. To anyone watching from afar, they would have appeared as two lonely souls carrying one another through the heart of winter. After what felt like an eternity, the outline of Frost Hollow finally emerged through the swirling snow. Warm lights glowed faintly from scattered cottages beyond the trees, filling Emily with renewed determination. Her legs ached with exhaustion, and her fingers had become almost numb despite thick wool gloves, yet she refused to stop until the wolf reached safety. Unseen by Emily, the great white wolf looked at her once more with an expression no ordinary animal should have possessed. Within those quiet silver eyes rested not only gratitude, but the silent promise that the extraordinary kindness shown upon the frozen river would never be forgotten for as long as it lived. Emily Carter pushed open the weathered wooden door of her small cabin with her shoulder, and a wave of comforting warmth from the fading fireplace greeted them as snow swirled inside before the door quickly closed again. The little home was simple, built by her late father years before, with rough pine walls, shelves lined with dried herbs, and a stone hearth that remained the heart of every winter evening. She carefully guided the great white wolf onto a thick woven rug beside the fire, allowing the animal to settle at its own pace instead of forcing it to move. The wolf released a slow breath and rested its head upon its front paws, its silver eyes quietly following every step she took. Emily immediately added fresh firewood until bright flames danced higher, filling the cabin with gentle orange light that chased away the bitter cold clinging to their clothes. Steam soon rose from a small iron kettle hanging above the fire, while the scent of cedar and mountain herbs slowly filled the room. She removed her damp cloak, hung it near the hearth to dry, and knelt beside the wolf once again. "Let me see how you are doing," she whispered. Her hands moved with practiced care as she examined the injured foreleg. She found swelling but no obvious break, which filled her with cautious hope. Opening a wooden cabinet, she gathered clean linen strips, dried willow bark, arnica flowers, pine resin, and a jar of herbal salve she had prepared before winter arrived. Mixing the ingredients into a warm paste, she gently spread the medicine over the sore area before wrapping the leg with fresh linen. Throughout the treatment, the wolf remained remarkably calm, watching her with complete trust. Every now and then its ears lifted whenever she spoke, as though the sound of her voice alone offered reassurance. Emily smiled softly. "You are much braver than most people I know." She laughed quietly at her own words before preparing a simple meal. There was only a small loaf of bread, a bowl of vegetable stew, and the last portion of smoked venison she had been saving for the coming weekend. Without hesitation, she sliced the meat into smaller pieces and placed them before the wolf. The magnificent animal hesitated, almost as if reluctant to accept the sacrifice. But after Emily nodded encouragingly, it finally ate. Watching the wolf regain a little strength brought her far greater satisfaction than keeping the meal for herself. She finished her own modest supper with bread and warm broth, completely content. Outside, the snowstorm continued to roar against the cabin walls while icy wind rattled the windows. But inside, everything felt peaceful. Emily sat in an old rocking chair near the fireplace and quietly mended a worn mitten beneath the glow of an oil lamp. Across the room, the wolf rested comfortably, yet it never truly slept. Its thoughtful silver eyes returned to her again and again, studying the young Omega whose kindness asked for nothing in return. It had known countless people who sought power, recognition, or reward, but this woman expected none of those things. She simply believed that every life deserved compassion. As the evening grew later, Emily placed another log onto the fire before spreading an extra blanket near the hearth. "You should stay close to the warmth tonight," she said gently. "Tomorrow will be a better day." The wolf slowly lowered its head once more, but before closing its eyes, it looked at Emily with quiet gratitude so deep and unmistakably human that, for the briefest moment, she wondered whether destiny itself had stepped across her threshold disguised beneath white fur and winter snow. The first rays of morning sunlight slipped gently through the frost-covered window, painting soft golden patterns across the wooden floor as Emily Carter slowly opened her eyes. For a brief moment she smiled, remembering that her unusual guest had made it safely through the bitter winter night. She rose quietly from her small bed, placed another piece of firewood onto the glowing embers, and turned toward the woven rug beside the fireplace. Her smile faded into silent surprise. The great white wolf was gone. Only the neatly folded wool blanket remained where the magnificent creature had rested only hours before. Emily walked slowly across the room, kneeling beside the empty space. The linen bandage she had carefully wrapped around the injured foreleg was missing as well, yet the floor showed no signs of struggle or panic. Instead, large paw prints crossed the cabin before disappearing through the slightly open front door. A cold breeze drifted inside, carrying the fresh scent of pine and clean snow. Emily gently closed the door and stepped outside, wrapping her gray cloak tightly around her shoulders. The storm had passed during the night, leaving Frost Hollow covered beneath sparkling snow that reflected the brilliant morning sun. The valley looked untouched, peaceful, and almost magical. She followed the fresh tracks for several yards until they reached the edge of the forest. There the prince suddenly stopped beside a cluster of towering pine trees, as though the wolf had quietly disappeared into the endless wilderness. Emily stood there for several moments, looking into the silent woods. "I hope you found your way home," she whispered with a warm smile. "Take care of yourself." She never expected an answer. Turning around, she returned to her simple daily routine. There was water to collect, herbs to dry, and neighbors who often needed her quiet help during the difficult winter months. By midday, she visited an elderly couple living at the far edge of the village, bringing them fresh medicinal tea and splitting firewood before refusing the small payment they offered. Later, she helped a young mother prepare herbal medicine for her son's winter cough, accepting nothing more than grateful smiles in return. To Emily, kindness had never been something measured by coins or recognition. It was simply the right thing to do whenever someone needed help. As the afternoon faded into evening, several villagers gathered near the marketplace, discussing unusual rumors spreading across nearby settlements. Travelers claimed they had seen royal scouts riding through the northern forests, while others insisted that the Alpha King's personal guards had recently been searching the region for someone or something of great importance. Emily barely listened as she arranged dried herbs inside her basket. Royal affairs belonged to distant castles and grand halls, not to a quiet Omega living alone in a tiny cabin beside the frozen river. She wished whoever the soldiers were searching for would be found safely, then continued walking home beneath the glowing orange sky. High above the valley, hidden beyond snow-covered cliffs where no ordinary villager could possibly see, a lone rider paused beside an overlook. Wrapped in a dark traveling cloak, the man gazed silently toward the tiny cabin resting beside the frozen river. His calm gray eyes reflected both gratitude and quiet admiration as memories of warmth, gentle hands, and a fearless heart lingered within him. Without speaking a single word, he turned his horse toward the distant capital, carrying with him a promise that the extraordinary Omega who had shown compassion without asking a single question would not remain unknown forever. 3 quiet days passed after the mysterious wolf disappeared into the snow-covered forest, and life in Frost Hollow returned to its familiar rhythm. Emily Carter spent each morning gathering firewood, preparing herbal remedies, and visiting neighbors who depended upon her gentle hands and patient heart. Although she occasionally glanced toward the frozen river while collecting winter herbs, she never expected to see the magnificent white wolf again. She simply hoped it had found safety somewhere beyond the endless pine forest stretching across the northern mountains. On the 4th morning, the peaceful silence of the village was interrupted by the distant sound of horses approaching along the frozen road. Children abandoned their snow games and ran toward the village entrance while merchants stepped outside their shops, shielding their eyes against the bright winter sun. Within minutes, a magnificent procession emerged from the forest. Nearly 24 royal guards rode in perfect formation upon powerful black horses, their polished silver armor reflecting the morning light like mirrors across the snow. Deep blue banners embroidered with the royal crest fluttered proudly in the icy wind. Behind them rolled an elegant carriage trimmed with dark oak and silver, followed by several additional riders whose disciplined movements revealed years of military training. No member of the royal household had visited Frost Hollow in living memory. Curious whispers spread rapidly through the gathered crowd. Some believed an important inspection was taking place. Others feared a dangerous criminal had escaped into the northern forests. Emily quietly stood near the edge of the gathering with her woven herb basket resting against her arm, feeling just as confused as everyone else. She had no reason to imagine that the extraordinary visitors had anything to do with her ordinary life. The procession slowly came to a stop in the center of the village square. Every guard dismounted in perfect unison before one senior officer stepped forward and respectfully opened the carriage door. A tall man emerged wearing a dark navy winter cloak fastened with an elegant silver clasp. His calm posture carried quiet authority rather than arrogance, and although the heavy cloak concealed much of his clothing, nothing could hide the natural confidence that surrounded him. Snowflakes drifted gently through the crisp air as he removed his gloves and allowed his steady gray eyes to sweep across the gathered villagers. Those eyes paused almost immediately. They rested upon Emily. For a long moment, the entire square seemed to disappear around him. Emily felt strangely familiar with that calm, unwavering gaze, yet she could not understand why. She searched her memory, certain they had never met before. The man slowly walked toward her, each measured step leaving a clear imprint in the fresh snow. Villagers instinctively moved aside, creating a silent path between them. Emily lowered her eyes respectfully, uncertain whether she should bow or simply greet the distinguished visitor. Before she could decide, the man stopped only a few feet away. His expression softened into the faintest smile, one filled not with formality but genuine gratitude. He looked at her exactly as someone might look upon a treasured memory unexpectedly found again after believing it was lost forever. Around them, complete silence settled across Frost Hollow. Even the restless winter wind seemed to pause. No one understood why the mysterious nobleman had crossed an entire kingdom only to stand before a humble Omega healer. Emily herself remained completely unaware that the quiet stranger before her carried a truth capable of changing not only her future, but the destiny of the entire village forever. Emily Carter slowly raised her eyes to meet the stranger's steady gray gaze, still unable to understand why his expression carried such quiet warmth. The villagers stood in complete silence around them, exchanging confused glances as the royal guards remained perfectly still behind their mysterious leader. Snow drifted gently through the crisp winter air, settling upon polished armor and the rooftops of Frost Hollow while every heart seemed to wait for the next words. The tall man placed one hand over his chest in a gesture of sincere respect before speaking with a calm voice that carried easily across the village square. "Emily Carter," he said, "I have traveled many miles to thank the woman who saved my life." A ripple of surprise spread through the crowd. Emily blinked in confusion. "There must be some mistake," she answered softly. "I have never met you before." The man smiled gently, not with amusement, but with understanding. "You met me," he replied, "on the frozen river 4 mornings ago." Emily searched his face, trying to remember, but nothing made sense. She had never seen this distinguished nobleman. The silence grew deeper until he continued. "When you found me, I could not stand before you as I do now. I was wounded and trapped within the form of a white wolf." Gasps echoed across the square. Several villagers looked at one another in disbelief, while others instinctively turned toward Emily. Her eyes widened as memories rushed back with startling clarity. The silver eyes, the calm breathing, the unusual intelligence behind every quiet glance. Suddenly, every impossible detail she had ignored began fitting together. She remembered how the wolf had seemed to understand every gentle word she spoke and how it had carefully steadied her while crossing the frozen river. She remembered the thoughtful look it had given her beside the fireplace before dawn. The stranger inclined his head respectfully. "I am Alexander Brooks," he said, "Alpha King of the Northern Kingdom." At once every royal guard bowed. The village elder fell to one knee, followed quickly by merchants, families, and nearly everyone gathered in the square. Shock swept across Frost Hollow like the winter wind. The Alpha King himself had stood among them without ceremony, and the humble Omega healer had unknowingly rescued him when no one else was there. Emily remained frozen in place, overwhelmed by the revelation. She had never imagined that the exhausted wolf she had wrapped in her own blanket had been the ruler of the entire kingdom. Alexander stepped one pace closer, his voice becoming quieter, meant not only for the village but especially for her. "When I was alone in the storm, you did not ask whether I was powerful. You did not ask what reward I could offer. You saw only a life in need of compassion, and you risked your own safety to protect it." Emily lowered her eyes, feeling embarrassed by the attention. "I only did what anyone should have done," she answered honestly. Alexander gently shook his head. "Many would have walked away. You did not." The Alpha King's words settled over the silent crowd with quiet strength. For the first time, the people of Frost Hollow looked at Emily not simply as the kind Omega who gathered herbs and helped her neighbors, but as someone whose courage had reached far beyond the borders of their forgotten village. And although no one could yet see how greatly that single act of kindness would reshape the future, every person standing beneath the falling snow understood they were witnessing the beginning of a story that would be remembered for generations. The silence that followed Alexander Brooks's revelation lingered over Frost Hollow like the gentle snowfall that continued drifting from the winter sky. Emily Carter could still scarcely believe what she had heard. The weary white wolf she had carried across the frozen river, sheltered beside her fireplace, and cared for with her final supplies had been the Alpha King himself. Around them, the villagers remained motionless, their eyes shifting between the humble Omega healer and the ruler standing before her with unmistakable gratitude. Alexander slowly raised one hand, and a royal guard stepped forward carrying an elegant oak chest reinforced with polished silver. As the lid was carefully opened, sunlight reflected from neatly stacked gold coins, fine jewelry, and royal documents bearing the king's seal. Another pair of guards brought forward bolts of rich cloth, warm winter blankets, and baskets filled with food that would have sustained an ordinary family through many months of harsh weather. Quiet amazement spread across the square. No one in Frost Hollow had ever seen such wealth gathered in one place. Alexander looked directly at Emily. "These gifts can never equal what you gave me," he said with calm sincerity. "You protected my life when you believed I was nothing more than an injured creature abandoned by the storm. Please accept them as a small expression of my gratitude." Every eye turned toward Emily. Some villagers smiled hopefully, believing no one could possibly refuse such generosity. Others nodded quietly, convinced that fate had finally rewarded the kindest person in their forgotten village. Emily gazed at the treasures for several long moments before lifting her eyes to meet Alexander's once again. Her gentle expression never changed. "Your Majesty," she said respectfully, "I am deeply honored that you came here yourself, but I cannot accept these gifts." A murmur swept through the gathered crowd. Even several royal guards exchanged surprised glances. Alexander remained perfectly still, studying her face with quiet curiosity rather than disappointment. "May I ask why?" he said softly. Emily smiled with the same warmth she had shown the wounded wolf beside the frozen river. "When I found you, I did not know you were a king. I saw someone who needed help. If I accept riches now, it would make my kindness seem like a trade instead of a choice. I never wanted payment. I only hoped you would recover." Her words settled gently across the silent village, carrying far greater weight than the gold resting inside the royal chest. Alexander lowered his head for a brief moment, and when he looked back at her, there was unmistakable admiration in his gray eyes. "You continue to teach me," he said quietly, "even after saving my life." Emily offered a modest smile. Kindness becomes smaller when it expects something in return. The Alpha King slowly closed the lid of the treasure chest with his own hands. No disappointment crossed his face. Instead, an expression of profound respect replaced every trace of ceremony. At that moment, he understood that the greatest gift standing before him was not courage alone, but a heart that could not be purchased by wealth or honor. The villagers who had known Emily all their lives suddenly realized that the quiet compassion they had often taken for granted possessed a strength greater than riches themselves. And deep within Alexander's heart, a new decision quietly took shape, one that would honor Emily's kindness not by changing who she was, but by protecting everything she had always loved. Alexander Brooks allowed several quiet moments to pass before speaking again. The treasure chest remained closed between them, untouched, its polished silver edges reflecting the soft winter sunlight that covered Frost Hollow in a peaceful glow. The Alpha King looked across the gathered villagers, seeing weathered homes, worn fences, and narrow paths buried beneath snow. He noticed elderly couples carrying heavy buckets of water, children sharing threadbare winter scarves, and families whose determination had always been stronger than their circumstances. Then his eyes returned to Emily Carter, whose calm expression had never changed despite standing before the ruler of the kingdom. "If your kindness cannot be purchased," Alexander said with quiet respect, "then I must honor it another way." Emily tilted her head slightly, uncertain what he meant. The Alpha King raised his hand, and the captain of the royal guards immediately stepped forward with a leather case containing official royal documents. Alexander accepted the papers and turned toward the villagers. His voice carried clearly through the crisp mountain air. "Beginning today, Frost Hollow will become a protected royal community." A wave of astonishment spread across the crowd. The villagers exchanged uncertain glances, wondering whether they had heard correctly. Alexander continued, "A permanent stone bridge will be built across the frozen river before next winter. Safe roads will connect this valley to nearby towns. A medical clinic and a school will be established here, and every family will receive support during the coldest months until the community can fully thrive on its own." Tears appeared in the eyes of several elderly residents who had spent their entire lives believing their forgotten village would never receive such attention. Parents quietly embraced their children, while hopeful smiles slowly replaced years of quiet resignation. Emily looked around at her neighbors, overwhelmed by the joy spreading across faces she had known since childhood. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "this is far more than anyone could have imagined." Alexander smiled gently. "It is not charity," he replied. "It is gratitude carried forward. One act of compassion deserves to create many more." He then turned back toward Emily with thoughtful sincerity. "You refused riches because you believed kindness should never expect payment. I respect that. Therefore, I will not reward only you. I will protect the people whose lives shaped the woman who crossed a frozen river to save a stranger." Emily lowered her eyes, deeply moved by words she had never expected to hear. She realized that the greatest gift was not wealth placed into her hands, but hope placed into the future of everyone she loved. The village elder stepped forward with trembling hands and bowed respectfully before the Alpha King. "For generations we believed the kingdom had forgotten us," he said. "Today you have reminded us that goodness still reaches even the quietest corners." Alexander gently shook his head. "Do not thank me alone. If Emily had walked away that day, none of us would be standing here together." The villagers turned toward Emily once more, but this time there was no surprise in their eyes. There was admiration, gratitude, and affection for the young Omega who had never sought recognition for the countless quiet acts of kindness that had always defined her life. As snowflakes drifted softly around the village square, Alexander understood that true strength was not measured by the authority of a crown, but by the courage to show compassion when no one was watching. and Emily quietly realized that even the smallest act of mercy could echo farther than anyone could ever imagine. 1 year later, winter returned to Frost Hollow, but the valley no longer resembled the forgotten village it had once been. A magnificent stone bridge now stretched across the river that had once separated families whenever the ice became too dangerous to cross, allowing wagons, travelers, and merchants to move safely throughout every season. A small medical clinic stood near the village square, its shelves filled with fresh medicines and healing supplies, while laughter drifted from the windows of the new school, where children eagerly learned skills their parents had never been given the chance to study. The narrow dirt paths had become well-kept roads, and warm lanterns illuminated the streets each evening, making the long winter nights feel far less lonely than before. Yet despite all the changes surrounding her, Emily Carter remained exactly the person she had always been. Every morning, she walked through the forest with her familiar woven basket, gathering herbs beneath the towering pines, greeting neighbors with the same gentle smile, and quietly helping anyone who needed comfort without expecting anything in return. Many visitors who arrived from distant towns assumed she held an important royal position because the Alpha King himself had transformed the village after meeting her. They were always surprised to discover that Emily still lived inside the same modest wooden cabin beside the river, believing that kindness did not require a larger home to become meaningful. As another peaceful afternoon settled across Frost Hollow, a familiar procession appeared along the stone bridge. This time there was no urgency, no confusion, and no fearful whispers. Children smiled as the royal guards approached, and villagers welcomed them as trusted friends. At the center of the procession rode Alexander Brooks, no longer arriving as a mysterious stranger, but as a respected king who had faithfully kept every promise he had made. When he stepped down from his horse, Emily greeted him with the same warm smile she had offered the injured white wolf one snowy evening long ago. Nothing about her kindness had changed simply because she now knew who he was. Alexander looked around the thriving village with quiet satisfaction before turning back to Emily. "Your compassion reached farther than either of us imagined," he said. Emily gently shook her head. "People built this together," she answered. "I only helped one traveler find his way home." Alexander smiled, remembering the frozen river, the warm fire inside the little cabin, and the fearless Omega who had chosen mercy over fear when no one else had been there to witness it. He knew history would remember bridges, schools, and royal decrees, but he also understood that every lasting change had begun with one simple decision made by an ordinary woman whose heart valued every life equally. As evening sunlight painted the snow with shades of gold, villagers gathered upon the stone bridge, watching children laugh while families crossed safely from one side of the river to the other. Many years from then, travelers would hear the story of Frost Hollow and assume it was merely another legend told beside winter fires. Yet those who had lived through those remarkable days always smiled because they knew the truth. A kingdom had not been changed by power, wealth, or fear. It had been changed by a young white-skinned Omega who chose compassion without asking a single question, and by a white-skinned Alpha King wise enough to recognize that the greatest strength any ruler could ever protect was the quiet goodness found within an ordinary human heart.